10-year-old Bridgette Biddy Porter of New South Wales, was brutally killed on a winter morning in July 2020 at a rural farmhouse by someone she knew. Her parents received the devastating news within minutes, and their lives were forever divided into before and after. This is the story of Biddy, her family, and their fight for justice. Bridgette Biddy Porter was a 10-year-old girl living in New South Wales, Australia, whose life was defined by creativity, kindness, and an early sense of justice. She was the youngest child and only daughter of Rebecca and Dominic Porter, and she shared an especially close bond with both parents. At home, Biddy was known for her warmth, humor, and gentle nature. Her family described her as highly intelligent, emotionally aware, and naturally expressive, with a deep curiosity about the world around her. Writing came easily to her, and she dreamed of becoming a journalist, a goal that reflected both her talent with words and her interest in understanding people and events. While many children admired pop stars or television characters, Biddy looked up to journalists, covering her bedroom walls with their photographs. She loved poetry, music, and animals, and her father remembered her as musically gifted and intellectually curious, with a thoughtful way of engaging with life. Her creativity extended beyond hobbies, shaping how she connected with others. Biddy also showed a strong sense of justice from a young age. When she witnessed bullying at school, she stepped in and told older students to stop, an instinctive act that reflected her courage and empathy. Her parents recalled her as deeply sensitive to others' feelings and driven by a desire to protect people who could not defend themselves. She cared deeply about fairness and compassion. At home, she was affectionate and openly loving, often sleeping in her parents' bed until the age of 9, a memory they now hold closely. Her laughter, curiosity, and emotional openness filled their household. Everything about her life suggested promise, possibility, and a future still unfolding, before the morning her story was abruptly and tragically cut short. On the morning of July 8, 2020, during the winter school holidays, Rebecca Porter was on her way to work when her phone rang. Her former father-in-law asked a question she could not understand. What had happened to Bridgette? Moments later, Dominic Porter called and said the words that shattered her life, telling her their daughter was dead. Rebecca later said her body shut down completely. She could not eat, could not dress herself, and struggled to comprehend what she had been told. Police soon confirmed that 10-year-old Bridgette Biddy Porter had been killed at a rural farmhouse in Orange, New South Wales. Dominic recalled reacting physically when officers delivered the news, punching a wall in anguish. The child who had filled their home with laughter, writing, music, and warmth was suddenly gone, and nothing felt real anymore. Both parents described the moment as the instant their lives split into before and after. Authorities revealed that the offender was a teenage girl known to Biddy. Because of the severity of the violence involved, the Supreme Court of New South Wales imposed strict suppression orders. For 20 years, the manner of death, the injuries, and the specific circumstances surrounding the killing could not be publicly disclosed. The offender was arrested within hours of the crime, demonstrating swift police action even as legal silence descended over the case. For Rebecca and Dominic, there was no sense of relief, only disbelief and grief. The shock of that morning lingered, unanswered questions hanging over everything they did. Despite the quick arrest, the journey toward justice would become long and painful. In 2021, the teenage offender was found guilty of murdering Bridgette Biddy Porter, but was declared not criminally responsible due to mental illness. Instead of a prison sentence, the court ordered placement in a forensic mental health facility, where the offender remains under treatment. Their identity is legally protected and cannot be publicly disclosed. For Rebecca and Dominic Porter, the ruling felt devastating. They believed their daughter's life had been overshadowed by a system that appeared to prioritize the offender's welfare while silencing the victim. Rebecca later said the decision left her feeling that justice had been replaced by procedure, and that her child's suffering had become secondary to legal definitions and medical assessments. That distress deepened when the family learned the offender could be granted escorted leave and, eventually, release into the community. Rebecca described this as unbearable, saying it felt as though her daughter's safety and dignity no longer mattered, even in death. The uncertainty surrounding future release became another source of anxiety layered onto grief. Under New South Wales law, the name, image, and story of a child murder victim cannot be publicly shared without family consent. Although intended to protect children's privacy, the effect in Biddy's case was silence. Rebecca said her daughter had been taken twice, first through violence, and then through erasure. She described the suppression as stripping Biddy of her identity, while the person responsible remained protected by the system. The courtroom outcome closed one chapter, but opened another. For the Porters, the legal decision marked the beginning of a struggle, extending beyond verdicts into questions of transparency, accountability, and victims' families' treatment. Rebecca and Dominic Porter were profoundly affected by the death of their 10-year-old daughter, Bridgette "Biddy" Porter. In the aftermath, both were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and severe depression, leaving them unable to return to work since 2020. Rebecca recalls the first weeks after Biddy's death as a period when her body shut down completely. She could not feed herself, dress, or function independently. Approximately 18 months after the tragedy, she experienced a significant breakdown, further highlighting the depth of her psychological trauma. Dominic similarly describes a persistent sense of anguish and helplessness, struggling to process the loss of his only daughter. Living in rural New South Wales compounded the difficulty of accessing trauma-informed mental health care. Victim services funding provided only limited financial support, including small recognition payments and a restricted number of counseling sessions. Many of these services were unavailable locally, forcing the Porters to navigate logistical and bureaucratic barriers on top of their grief. The isolation intensified their emotional suffering, leaving them with few avenues for professional support. Legal restrictions further exacerbated their distress. Suppression orders prevented the public disclosure of Biddy's identity, image, and the circumstances of her death, effectively silencing the family. Rebecca has said that this imposed silence made grieving more isolating, as the couple could not share their daughter's story or advocate for her memory. Their sense of helplessness was compounded by systemic shortcomings, revealing the broader failings of institutions responsible for supporting victims' families after violent crime. These combined factors, psychological trauma, limited support, and systemic barriers, shaped the Porters' experience of grief. Over time, their frustration with institutional processes grew, motivating them to seek transparency, accountability, and reform within the justice system to honor their daughter and prevent similar hardships for other families. The Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions refused to release the full brief of evidence or the statement of facts regarding Bridgette "Biddy" Porter's murder, citing the distressing nature of the material. Rebecca and Dominic Porter experienced this as a denial of transparency, leaving them unable to fully understand how justice had been pursued for their daughter. They believed that without access to these documents, families of victims were systematically excluded from critical information about legal proceedings that directly affected them and their child's case. The Porters also faced repeated participation in 6 monthly reviews conducted by the Mental Health Review Tribunal concerning the offender's detention and treatment. Each review compelled the family to revisit the circumstances of Biddy's death, reliving trauma without any legal authority to influence the outcomes. Decisions regarding the offender's potential release or treatment conditions were made without input from Rebecca and Dominic, reinforcing a sense of powerlessness within the system. Advocacy Australia became involved, supporting the family and highlighting institutional shortcomings. Alice Collins, speaking on behalf of the organization, emphasized the lack of accountability and transparency in the forensic mental health system, noting how victims' families were rendered invisible despite being most affected by the proceedings. The organization worked to amplify the Porters' concerns and push for systemic reform that would recognize the rights and perspectives of victims' families in decision-making processes. Confronted with institutional barriers, the Porters' grief transformed into determination. Their private anguish became a call for action, as they sought public avenues to ensure their daughter's story was heard and her memory honored. This period of frustration and advocacy set the stage for the launch of the Justice for Biddy Porter campaign, marking a pivotal shift from private suffering to organized, public demand for transparency and accountability in the justice system. In 2024, Rebecca and Dominic Porter launched the #JusticeForBiddyPorter campaign, seeking public accountability and systemic reform following the death of their daughter. Working closely with Advocacy Australia and independent MP Phil Donato, the campaign demanded parliamentary inquiries into the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Mental Health Review Tribunal, as well as reforms to victim services. Additionally, the family called for a coronial inquest to examine the circumstances surrounding Biddy's death and the systemic failings that had compounded their loss. The campaign rapidly gained public support. A petition circulated nationally and internationally, ultimately surpassing 40,000 signatures. This overwhelming response triggered a parliamentary debate on October 17, 2024, where the significance of the case and the family's concerns were formally addressed. For Rebecca Porter, hearing her daughter's name spoken in Parliament for the first time since the tragedy was an intensely emotional moment. She described the experience as restoring Biddy's identity and voice, countering years of legal suppression that had effectively erased her child's presence from public discourse. The Justice for Biddy campaign drew widespread media attention, sparking national discussions on the rights of victims' families, mental health law, and the oversight of forensic patient management. The Porters consistently emphasized that their goal was not punitive, but focused on achieving transparency, accountability, and reform. The campaign underscored the need for institutional responsiveness to victims' families while maintaining legal safeguards for offenders. Through coordinated advocacy, public engagement, and legislative pressure, the campaign established a bridge between private grief and systemic change. Its momentum set the stage for subsequent reforms in mental health legislation, parliamentary scrutiny, and the coronial inquest, illustrating the tangible impact of public advocacy in shaping justice systems and ensuring that the experiences of victims and their families are formally recognized. In November 2024, New South Wales Minister for Mental Health Rose Jackson introduced the Mental Health Legislation Amendment Bill 2024, responding directly to concerns raised through the Justice for Biddy campaign. The legislation passed Parliament in early 2025 and received assent in March of the same year. These reforms implemented changes to the forensic mental health system and adjusted processes within the Mental Health Review Tribunal, aiming to improve transparency, oversight, and consideration of victims' perspectives in decisions affecting forensic patients. Following the legislative changes, the New South Wales State Coroner confirmed that a coronial inquest into the death of Bridgette Biddy Porter would be held in mid-2026. The inquest is tasked with examining the circumstances that led to her killing, as well as investigating whether systemic failures within legal and mental health institutions contributed to the tragedy. This inquest represents a critical step toward accountability and understanding for Biddy's family and the broader public. Throughout these developments, Biddy's character remains central to the narrative. Known for her intelligence, kindness, empathy, and courage, she instinctively stood up for others and nurtured those around her. Her parents' persistent advocacy reflects the values she embodied in life, translating personal grief into action for systemic change. The outcomes of the campaign, including legislative reform and the scheduled coronial inquest, demonstrate the lasting impact of Biddy's story. While her life was tragically short, her experience has influenced legal structures, increased public awareness, and strengthened victim advocacy in New South Wales. Her legacy emphasizes that every case file represents a human life, and her story continues to resonate through reforms, accountability, and remembrance. Through these measures, Biddy Porter's voice endures, shaping both policy and collective consciousness, ensuring that her life, values, and memory continue to affect meaningful change in the systems designed to protect others.